I wanted to have a little chat about water loading, what it is and why we actually do it. If you're in a weight class, the chances are that you tend to sit a few kilos over your competition weight and you water load down in order to make competition weight. There's usually a strict protocol with this with how it all works, but a lot of people don't actually understand why it works or what's going on in our body. So it's typically known as to trick your body into peeing out more so that you dehydrate and lose a few kilos, and then once you've weighed in you'll rehydrate, you'll regain that weight, and you'll compete heavier than you typically would if you just cut body fat to get to that competition weight, because that way you risk losing muscle mass as well if you're cutting body fat. So with a water load, there's a lot of mixed things online about how much water you should drink, and you'll find formulas which is X amount per kilo of body weight and blah blah blah. But typically I find for majority of people 7 to 8 litres works perfectly. Even if you're a heavyweight man, there's no reason really to go over that unless you tend to have a really high water intake on a daily basis anyway, due to sweating a lot, being active, things like that. But 7 to 8 litres tends to work well for most people. So a water load isn't really tricking your body into peeing out more. You can't really trick your body into anything. What actually happens is you have a hormone called vasopressin, which is an antidiuretic hormone. The more water that you drink, the more likely that this hormone is to get suppressed. Once this hormone is suppressed, you will start to pee out more. So when you drastically increase your water intake, usually it'll be double to potentially triple what you tend to drink on a normal daily basis, your vasopressin hormone will become suppressed, so you will start peeing out a lot more water. This also, as the longer that vasopressin is suppressed, you will also create more aquaporin 2 channels, which are floodgates in and out of your kidneys in terms of letting water in and out, which again helps you to excrete more water. With a water load, you'll usually do some form of sodium load or sodium manipulation as well. This helps to create a bigger gradient for the water loss, so you tend to lose more this way, but it also helps to avoid hyponatremia, and you'll start dehydrating pretty much straight away as your vasopressin is suppressed, but you might start your water load 5 or 6 days out, so you don't want to be in a dehydrated state for that amount of time. So with the increased water, you will increase your sodium to start with and your electrolytes, and then you'll usually go on to from having a high salt intake to a normal salt intake, and then your final day you'll tend to cut your salt and water. Now this is where it gets interesting. So there's some studies on how water loads work and what happens within your body. There's not that many, but there are some. But the interesting thing is that once you decrease your water intake and it's almost back to normal levels or even lower than normal levels, your vasopressin only stays suppressed for a set amount of time. And this amount of time varies from person to person, but it can be as little as a few hours. So as soon as you start drinking again, you are going to hold water. You're going to hold most of what you drink. You will keep your salt low at this stage, just so you're less likely to hold more water. So it will vary from person to person what you do on one day out from weighing in terms of how much water you drink. I've played around with my water load quite a bit, and it's interesting the things that I found out with it. And I'd like, if other people have a water load that they've been doing a certain procedure with it for so much time and they've played around with the final day, I would like to know what actually works for you, and if you've noticed any changes with how much water you actually have on the final day and how much you hold and how much you lose. Because I found that I've done it where I've cut my water to 2 litres, so under a normal intake, not too low, but there's a big enough gradient from what I started drinking to carry on urinating and dehydrate. But what I found that if I'll wake up and I'll just sip the 2 litres throughout the whole day, maybe stop 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening. But I found that I tend to hold more water when I do it this way. Everything that I tend to drink, I just seem to hold. I don't lose that much on one day out from weighing. I tend to lose more as I start the water load, and as the salt's reduced down, I tend to lose more around the 2 to 3 days out is when I get my biggest drops, and one day I don't notice much of a difference. So I've played around with it, and what I've actually done is I've carried on water loading until midday 1 p.m. of the day before weighing, rather than reducing it for that day. I've carried on my water load, so I might have had 4 litres up until midday or something, and then from midday until weighing I've not really had much. I might have maybe another 200-300 ml later on in the evening if I get a little bit thirsty, and I'll sip that. But I found that I tend to lose more this way. As I carry on my water load, my body still suppresses vasopressin, and then I'll just cut the water completely. A lot of people will cut their water completely for the day before weigh-in. They won't have anything whatsoever, which again, that will work, but you are going to be in a very dehydrated state for a very long amount of time. With a water load, you want to stay as hydrated as you can for as long as possible. Also, the goal is to dehydrate, and you've got to dehydrate at some point, but you don't want to be in a dehydrated state for longer than necessary. So it's interesting to see what a lot of people tend to do on the final day. And I've played around with this with clients. There's kind of a basic procedure I tend to use to start with because I know it works. And then we'll look at other ways to manipulate a little bit more and how to keep them feeling good for as long as possible. Because you don't really want to avoid not having any water whatsoever the day before you weigh in, especially if you've got a 2-hour weigh-in. If you've got a 24-hour weigh-in, you usually have enough time to rehydrate, and a lot of people will have a drip to help them rehydrate. But if you've got a 2-hour weigh-in, then you're going to be pretty fucked if you've not drank for 24 hours. After weigh-in, you will need to rehydrate. It's ideal to do this quite slowly. You don't want to just pile a lot of water in because then you're starting to suppress your vasopressin again and you're not actually hydrating. Drinks like Diarrhea are ideal. Usually a litre an hour for the first 2 to 3 hours is ideal, but with Diarrhea or some form of salts or rehydration drink. And then after that, you need to try and go back to your normal intake. You usually will feel quite thirsty, but you don't want to overdo your water and put yourself back into a water load. I will put a bit more information on this out at some point. I just don't want to make this video too long because it was more about how a water load actually works, not necessarily the procedure of it. So yeah, give me some comments if you've worked with a water load before, what works for you, especially you one day out, whether you just dehydrate completely, don't drink for that day, or if you've got a protocol where you reduce your water up to a certain point or carry on water loading up to a certain point or so on.